The first warning did not come from a lawyer. It did not come from a bodyguard, nor from anyone paid to protect him. It came from a 27-year-old waitress, carrying a tray of coffee with trembling hands, inside a private meeting room on the 14th floor of one of Manhattan's finest hotels. That morning, she only intended to do her job. Pour the coffee, clear the table, and hear nothing at all. But she was German, and no one in that room knew it. Seated at the head of the table was the most powerful man on the New York waterfront, smiling with complete confidence, because he trusted the interpreter beside him. Absolutely a man who had been with him for nearly 4 years, through hundreds of meetings across the world, without a single mistake. The waitress froze when she realized the interpreter was not translating a single word correctly. Then she heard the sentence that turned her blood cold. Everything would be finished the moment he signed, because the final payment had already been made to him, and the reply was far worse. After the signing ceremony, an accident would erase whatever remained. The interpreter looked straight at them. He smiled. Then he calmly turned and rendered something entirely different into English. She had only seconds to decide. If she stayed silent, she kept the job that was keeping her gravely ill mother alive. If she spoke, she lost everything, and there was no guarantee anyone would believe a woman carrying coffee over a room full of lawyers and executives. What no one in that room knew was that she had once sat in that very interpreter's chair, and she had lost it to a lie exactly like this one. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you are still listening. Share it with someone who still believes the truth is worth something. And don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next story about the courage of ordinary people. Greta Vogel carried the tray out of the Rosewood room with the careful gait of someone who had spent 6 years training herself to go unnoticed. And she made it all the way down the service corridor, through the wooden door separating the world of the guests from the world of the people who carried their plates, before she finally allowed herself to lean back against the wall. There were still 4 uncleared cups on the tray in her hands. She set it down on the metal counter and looked at her hands. They were still trembling. Inside her head, through some remnant of professional instinct she couldn't quite explain, a number kept appearing as clearly as if it had been printed on paper. 11. Not one mistranslated point. Not one expression shortened for convenience. 11 times, the man sitting beside the boss had said something the people on the other side of the table had never said at all. She had stopped counting at 11, not because there was nothing left to count, but because she realized she was doing the very thing she had sworn she would never do again for as long as she lived. Listening. At the far end of the corridor, the shift manager approached with the assignment sheet in his hand and stopped in front of her wearing the expression of a man with too many problems and too little time to solve them. Her night shift had ended at 6 that morning. By now, she should have been on the train home, but 2 members of the day shift had called in sick. The group staying on the 14th floor had reserved a private meeting room for the entire day, and the hotel had no one else reliable enough to be trusted inside a room like that. He told her to stay until the meeting ended, said she would be paid time and a half, then added one more sentence without realizing what he had just said. The guests in the Rosewood room don't like anyone looking them in the eye. Keep your head down, keep the cups full, and leave. Greta nodded. She said thank you, and she thought that only 30 seconds earlier, that instruction would have sounded like the most comforting thing a server could possibly hear. Now it sounded like something else entirely. She rinsed the coffee pot, brewed a fresh batch, arranged clean cups on the tray, and performed every one of those motions 1 beat more slowly than usual, because she needed time for her hands to stop shaking. Then she pushed the door open and went back inside. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been. The man at the head of the table was listening, both hands resting lightly on the folder in front of him, wearing the face of someone who believed he controlled everything happening in that room. The interpreter sat to his right, back straight, voice even, delivering every sentence at exactly the right pace, neither fast nor slow, the kind of rhythm only someone who had been doing the work for years could maintain. The 7 people on the other side of the table spoke among themselves in a language they were certain only one person in the room understood. Greta moved behind them, pouring coffee for each person, no faster and no slower than she normally would. She didn't look anyone in the eye. She filled the cup belonging to the man at the head of the table, and as the coffee pot tilted, she caught sight of his wrist, the old watch with a scratch running across the crystal, the only thing in the entire room that didn't look expensive. He said thank you. He didn't look up, but he said thank you. She stepped back and took her place beside the service cabinet, hands folded in front of her stomach, eyes lowered toward the floor, exactly as she had been taught during her first week on the job, and she stood there, listening as each sentence passed through the room, knowing exactly which ones were true and which ones were not. knowing what was being built on top of that table and what was being prepared beneath it. In that entire 18-story building, with 300 employees, with security stationed on the ground floor and men in suits standing outside the hallway, only one person knew what was about to happen. That person was holding the coffee pot, and that person also knew one more thing, more clearly than anyone else in the world, that if she opened her mouth, no one in that room would believe a single word she said. At 5 that afternoon, Greta got off the train at the end of the line, walked another 10 minutes, then climbed 4 flights of stairs in a building with no elevator, her hands still smelling faintly of coffee and dish soap, even though she had washed them 3 times before leaving the hotel. She unlocked the door by turning the key twice, and then pushing it open with her shoulder, because the lock had been broken since spring, and the landlord still hadn't sent anyone to repair it. Inside, Ilse Vogel was sitting in the chair beside the window, and draped over the back of the chair across from her, just as it had been for the past 6 years, was her husband's gray wool coat. No one was allowed to touch it. No one was allowed to take it away to be cleaned. Once, Greta had tried to fold it neatly, and her mother had gotten out of her sickbed to take it back. Greta had never tried again. Ilse heard the door, turned her head very slowly, and the first thing she asked her daughter, as she did on most afternoons, was whether anyone had called her name today. Greta took off her shoes, set her bag on the floor, and said no. No one had called her name. Then she added, in a voice as light as if she were talking about the weather, that this was a good thing. Ilse nodded, satisfied. She no longer remembered why that answer was good, but she remembered that it was, and for her now, that was enough. Some days she mistook Greta for an old neighbor from Hamburg. Some days she asked where her husband was and why he hadn't come home for dinner yet. The doctor called it a consequence of uneven blood flow to the brain after each dialysis session, and said the periods of clarity would gradually become shorter. Greta went into the kitchen, put a pot of water on the stove, and while she waited for it to boil, she took the notebook from the drawer. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. 3 sessions a week, 4 hours each, at a center 40 minutes from home by car. The federal program covered most of it, but most was not all. There was a co-payment for every session. There were additional medications that weren't covered, and there was transportation, because after 4 hours lying in the dialysis chair, Ilse couldn't walk to the train station by herself, couldn't stand and wait, couldn't climb 4 flights of stairs without someone helping her. Those 3 numbers added together each month came to almost exactly what Greta earned, carrying trays. She had calculated it so many times that she no longer needed a pen. Dinner was soup and bread. Ilse ate slowly, occasionally stopping to look at the coat draped over the chair before continuing. At one point, she asked her daughter what she did at the hotel, and Greta said she poured coffee. Ilse nodded. Then, in a voice that suddenly became much clearer, she said that once, Greta had worked in rooms with microphones, where people had to wait until she finished speaking before they were allowed to continue. Greta set down her spoon. She told her mother she was remembering it wrong. Ilse looked at her daughter for a long time, then said yes, she must be remembering wrong, and lowered her head to finish her soup. At 9 o'clock, Greta helped her mother into bed, pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, turned off the light, then went to lie down on the sofa. She had been awake for a full day and a full night. Her body felt as though it were coming apart, but when she closed her eyes, what appeared wasn't darkness. It was the room on the 14th floor, the warm yellow light overhead, the sound of porcelain touching saucers, and 2 men leaning their heads toward one another, speaking in a language they believed no one else in the room could understand. She heard every word again, as clearly as though they were still being spoken beside her ear. After the signing ceremony, an accident. It will erase what remains. In the darkness, Greta opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. 6 years earlier, her father had also died in an accident, on a street with no cameras, struck by a car no one had ever found. On the rooftop of the Ardennes House Hotel, where the river wind moved between 2 rows of potted plants, and the traffic of Manhattan had faded into a distant murmur, Rafe Castellari stood leaning against the railing, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago, and that he hadn't touched. Behind him, August Marchetti sat in a chair with both hands resting on his knees, the posture of a man accustomed to waiting for other people to finish thinking. Gus had sat that way beside Rafe's father for 20 years, and beside Rafe for another 5 since that night in the restaurant parking lot. He was the man who had taught him how to shake hands, how to count money without looking down, how to know when someone was lying simply by listening to the way they breathed. He had called him kid until Rafe was 30, and even now the words still slipped out from time to time. Gus said his father had never signed paperwork with his real name, not once. He had an entire lifetime to do it, and he never did. Rafe didn't turn around. He said his father had also never slept more than 4 hours a night, and he died at 51. Gus fell silent. He knew how to answer almost anything, but not that. Down below, 4 blocks away, workers were putting up scaffolding for a new building, and the sound of hammering drifted upward, thin as the ticking of a clock. Rafe set the cup on the railing. He said he wanted a harbor with licenses, audits, a payroll of 3,000 people, every one of them able to declare their income without having to stop and think about it. Gus asked what for. When that harbor had been operating for 25 years without needing a single piece of paper. Rafe said he wanted a sign outside the gate, bearing the family name, one that people wouldn't have to lower their voices to read aloud. When he finished, he said nothing more and offered no explanation. Gus stared at his back for a long time. Then he said, the Germans hadn't come to New York to give anyone a clean name. They had come to take something, and the only thing worth taking here was already in Rafe's hands. Rafe said he knew. He said he had paid a price to obtain it, and he was willing to pay another price, so he wouldn't have to keep holding it the old way. The door leading onto the rooftop opened. Ansel Reese stepped outside carrying a thin stack of papers, moving with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was permitted to enter, and exactly when. He apologized for interrupting and said Hansa Nord had just sent over the revised summary of terms, and they wanted Rafe's initials before dinner so they could present it to the board in Hamburg the following morning, local time. Rafe asked whether anything had changed from the version they had seen that afternoon. Ansel said nothing significant. Only 2 passages reworded to match their legal terminology, and 1 sentence concerning the notice period. He said it in the same steady, pleasant voice, neither too fast nor too slow. The voice Rafe had heard for 4 years in hundreds of rooms across dozens of cities. Rafe took the pen. He turned to the final page, initialed the corner, then handed the papers back. He didn't read them. He never had, because the German version ran down the left column, and to him, it was nothing more than rows of black letters without meaning, while the English version on the right had been written by the very man standing in front of him. Ansel thanked him, folded the papers closed, and went back inside. Gus watched the door shut behind him, then said he still didn't understand why Rafe didn't hire 2 interpreters for deals this large. Rafe said because he only needed 1 man he trusted. In 4 years, Ansel Rice had never let him take a wrong step in Milan, in Rotterdam, in Hamburg, in rooms where a single mistranslated word could cost a man everything. Rafe didn't know a single word of German, had never considered that a problem, and had never had any way of knowing that it had been a problem for a very long time. By 2 a.m, Greta was still lying on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, and she understood that she wasn't going to sleep again that night. In the room beside her, her mother was breathing steadily. Greta sat up, walked barefoot across the wooden floor, and opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet against the wall, the one where they kept household papers and old bills. The envelope lay at the very bottom beneath everything else, exactly where she had left it 6 years earlier. The edges had yellowed. She had never thrown it away, and she had never opened it a second time. She carried it to the kitchen table, switched on the small lamp, and pulled out the papers inside. The first page was the disciplinary board's ruling, printed on official letterhead, with the date in the upper right corner and her name on the 3rd line. Beneath it were 3 brief points written in the kind of administrative language that leaves no room for human beings. It stated that in the maritime arbitration case between 2 shipping companies, the translation of the transcript from the 2nd hearing had been found to contain discrepancies that directly affected the ruling. It stated that the translation bore the certification signature of the interpreter responsible. It stated that the professional license of the person who signed it had been revoked for an indefinite period. That was all. Not 1 line said that the copy she had signed and the copy the board held in its hands were 2 different documents. Not 1 line said that she had asked them to compare it against the audio recording and had been told that the hearing had never been recorded. Not 1 line said that when she asked who had been the last person to handle the transcript before it was submitted, no one answered her. The 2nd page was a letter from the association, 3 sentences long, polite to the point of cruelty, informing her that her name had been removed from the membership list and that all member organizations had been fully informed. That was the most important sentence in the entire packet. All member organizations had been fully informed. It meant every court, every law firm, every company on the East Coast that had ever hired conference interpreters already knew her name before she even had the chance to knock on their doors. She remembered making 41 phone calls in the first month. She remembered 1 woman at a law firm who had been kind enough to tell her the truth instead of asking her to call back later. In this profession, "There is only one thing you have to sell, dear, and you don't have it anymore." She remembered her father sitting at this very table, reading every word of the ruling, then folding it and saying that you didn't do this, so someone else must have. He had been the Harbor Union secretary for 22 years. He knew how to ask questions, knew who kept which records, knew which doors opened at what hour. He began asking. He didn't tell his wife or daughter what he was asking about. He only said that when he had enough, he would bring it home. 3 weeks later, he walked out of the house one evening and never came back. The gray wool coat was what they returned to her mother at the hospital. Greta sat for a very long time in front of those 2 sheets of paper, her hands resting on the table, thinking about the room on the 14th floor, about the man with the scratched watch face who had said thank you without looking up, about what was going to happen to him without his knowing any of it. Then she thought about her mother sleeping in the next room, about 3 sessions every week, about the 40-minute ride, about the numbers she had added and added again until she knew them by heart. She had spoken once before. She had spoken loudly and clearly, to everyone who should have listened. The result was that she lost her name, and her father lost far more than that. Greta folded the 2 sheets along the same old creases, slipped them back into the envelope, placed it at the bottom of the drawer, and stacked everything else on top. She turned off the light. This time, she wasn't going to open her mouth. The following afternoon, Greta arrived at the hotel half an hour before her shift, because she was afraid that if she stayed home even a little longer, she would come up with a reason not to go. In the employee changing room in the basement, 2 members of the day shift were standing beside the row of lockers, and they didn't lower their voices because they didn't think anyone else would be there at that hour. One said the guests on the 14th floor were staying another 3 days. The other said yes. Apparently someone from the city office had even come up to meet with them. Then the first added one more thing. In the same ordinary voice someone might use to talk about a holiday schedule, that Human Resources had just sent out a request to review the files of every employee assigned to serve the upper floors. All of them, including people who had worked there for years, because the guests had asked for it. Greta stood with her back to them, fastening the buttons of her uniform, and she finished the final button before allowing herself to breathe out. She knew exactly what a background review meant. They wouldn't find a criminal record because she didn't have one. They wouldn't find unpaid debts because those were all under the hospital's name, not hers. Someone would type her name into a search box, and within 3 minutes, the first thing to appear would be the ruling of a professional disciplinary board from 6 years earlier, along with 3 words no hotel wanted to see in the file of someone permitted to enter the private meeting rooms of important guests. Falsification of documents. On her job application, she had stated that she held a degree in languages and had once worked in an office. Not one word of it was false, but it wasn't enough either. Throughout that entire shift, Greta carried trays, poured water, changed table linens, while her mind kept running a calculation that never produced an answer. If she stayed silent, she could still lose her job in 2 weeks when someone opened her file, and then she would lose it quietly, with no one knowing why and no one asking questions. If she spoke, she would lose her job tomorrow, certainly, and this time, someone would know why. She had spent 6 years surviving by choosing the quiet option. She knew how to live with it. Near the end of the shift, when the meeting on the 14th floor broke for a recess and the kitchen staff began clearing away, Greta asked permission to leave 15 minutes early because her mother had a transportation pickup scheduled. The shift manager nodded without looking up. She changed clothes, put on her coat, and left through the rear entrance, the narrow alley between the kitchen wing and the garbage area where night shift workers often stood smoking. There, beneath the wall light, were 2 men. One was the elderly dishwasher she saw every evening, a stooped man whose hands were always red from hot water, and who always saved a piece of hard bread for her at the end of the shift. The other was Rafe Castellari. He was alone. He was saying something brief, his head inclined slightly so he could hear the older man clearly. Then he handed him something small, not money, but a piece of paper or a card, and added one more sentence. The old man nodded twice. Rafe gave his arm a gentle pat, then went back inside through the kitchen door. The entire exchange lasted less than half a minute. Greta stood partly hidden at the corner of the alley, one hand still gripping the strap of her bag, and she hadn't heard a single word. She thought of the 2 sheets of paper in the drawer. She thought of the woman at the law firm who had told her the truth directly, instead of asking her to call back later. Then, she thought of her father sitting at the kitchen table, folding the disciplinary ruling and saying that someone had to have done it, and how he had walked out the door to find that person for a daughter whose entire profession had turned its back on her. Greta remained still for a few more seconds. Then she turned around, walked back the way she had come, and pushed open the kitchen door. In the kitchen, steam was still rising from the dishwasher, and Rafe Castellari stood alone at the far end of the aisle between 2 rows of steel work tables, waiting for the service elevator. No one was standing within 10 paces of him. Greta walked toward him, and she kept going straight without slowing halfway there, because she knew that if she hesitated for even one beat, she would turn around. The man heard her footsteps and looked over. He didn't startle. He didn't raise a hand, didn't step back, didn't glance around for his people. He simply looked her over once from head to toe, then let his gaze settle on her face and waited. Greta heard the dishwasher running behind her and realized her throat was so dry she had to swallow before she could speak. She told him she worked in the Rosewood room. Rafe asked who she was. She gave him her name, first and last, clearly, as though she were saying it to someone who was going to write it down. Greta Vogel. Then she continued, using the shortest sentences she could manage because she only had that much breath in her. She told him she understood German. She told him his interpreter wasn't translating what the people on the other side were actually saying. And she told him that 2 of them had spoken to each other, in their own language, saying that he had already been paid the final amount, and that after the signing ceremony there would be an accident. Then she fell silent. Rafe Castellari said nothing. He stood completely still, both arms hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed directly on hers, while around them came the sound of the dishwasher, the clatter of someone stacking plates at a distant work table, the service elevator moving upward and stopping on another floor. 4 seconds passed. Greta counted them without meaning to, simply because she had spent her life counting things. During those 4 seconds, not a single feature of his face changed. No anger, no surprise, no dismissive smile. That frightened her more than anything she had imagined on the way over to him. Then he asked, in a low, measured voice, whether she knew what would happen to her if what she was saying was wrong. Greta heard the question and understood that it wasn't a threat. It was a real question. She answered that she knew what would happen to her if what she was saying was right, and that was worse. Rafe watched her for another moment. He asked what shift she worked. She said nights, but for the past 2 days they had kept her on to serve the meeting because they were short-staffed. He asked whether she had told anyone about this today. She said no. He asked whether anyone had seen her come into the kitchen through the back entrance. She said no. He gave one small nod and told her to go home. He told her to come to work tomorrow as usual, pour the coffee exactly as she had the day before, and say nothing to anyone, not even her shift manager, not even anyone in her family. Greta remained there for 1 more second, waiting for something else, some sentence that would tell her whether he believed her or not, but nothing came. She turned and walked away. At the kitchen door, she heard him say thank you, and she didn't look back. Once she was out in the alley, she walked all the way to the end of the block before realizing that her hand was still gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Inside, Rafe Castellari remained exactly where she had left him. The service elevator arrived. Its doors opened and then closed again, and he didn't step inside. He took the phone from his coat pocket, found a name in his contacts, and placed a call. At 11:40 that night, in the room on the 16th floor that Rafe Castellari had been using as his office for the duration of the German delegation's stay, one of his men placed a thin file on the table and stepped back. Less than 5 hours had passed since the call. Rafe pulled the file toward him. The first page was a copy of the hotel employee identification photograph. Greta Vogel, 27 years old, employed there for nearly 3 years, night shift, not a single complaint on record. The second page was what made him stop longer. A ruling from a professional disciplinary board 6 years earlier, revoking her certification as a conference interpreter, with the reason stated in 3 brief words: falsification of documents, specifically that the translated transcript of a maritime arbitration hearing had been altered in places that directly affected the ruling, and that translation bore her own certification signature. The next page was a copy of a local newspaper article, 6 lines in the lower corner, about a man named Thomas Vogel, who had been struck by a car on the street one evening. The vehicle hadn't stopped. The case had been closed after 4 months because there were no witnesses and no cameras. The final page listed the debts: hospital bills, the dialysis center, a small unsecured loan that had fallen overdue twice, a mother with end-stage kidney failure, 3 treatments every week. Gus sat across from him, waited until Rafe had finished reading, then picked up the file and flipped back to the beginning, going through it once at the speed of a man who had read thousands of files in his lifetime and knew exactly what he was looking for. He closed it, set it down on the table, and said nothing for a while. Then he said he didn't doubt that the girl had heard something. In a hotel, someone was always hearing something. What he wanted to know was whether Rafe had ever stopped to wonder why this particular person was the one who had heard it. Rafe didn't answer. Gus continued, his voice still even, never rising at all, saying that this woman had been thrown out of her profession for altering a translation. Not for being late, not for arguing with a superior, but for changing words on paper in a case where money was involved. 6 years later, she was carrying trays through a hotel, and she walked up to Rafe, claiming that the man sitting in the place that once should have been hers was doing exactly the same thing she herself had been found guilty of doing. When Gus finished saying it, he left the words lying there between them. Then he added that Rafe was preparing to sign something this family had waited 25 years for, that the other side had 4 law firms and a board in Hamburg behind them, and Rafe was considering stopping the entire thing because of the word of someone whose own profession had already crossed her name off the list. Rafe still said nothing. He looked at the employee photograph on the first page, a face captured quickly beneath harsh white light, her hair pulled neatly back at the nape of her neck, her eyes looking straight into the camera in the way of someone accustomed to being photographed, without being asked. He thought about those 4 seconds in the kitchen, and the one thing he remembered most clearly wasn't what she had said, but the fact that she had never looked away during any of those 4 seconds. People who lie look somewhere else, or they stare too long. She had simply looked at him. When Gus saw that he had been silent too long, he let out a breath and spoke in the same voice he had used when Rafe was a 15-year-old boy, sitting in a car waiting for his father. He said, "Keep her there. Don't fire her. Don't let her know you listened. But don't let someone with a history like that stand anywhere near your seat for the next 3 days. And if you want peace of mind, I'll have someone review the entire contract again, from beginning to end. And if there is anything there, I'll tell you." Rafe nodded. He said, "All right." And in that moment, no one in the room knew that he had just given the one person who needed to know everything permission to know everything. At 6:15 in the morning, a diner in southern Brooklyn hadn't opened yet. The chairs still turned upside down on the tables in the back half of the room, and the man behind the counter gave Rafe Castellari a single nod before disappearing into the kitchen and not coming back out. Greta sat in the chair across from him, one hand still resting on the strap of her bag, because the slip of paper pushed beneath her apartment door the night before had contained only an address and a time, no name. Rafe slid a cup of coffee toward her. She didn't touch it. He placed a small black recorder on the table, the kind people used in meetings where an official record was kept, and said this was a meeting in Hamburg from 10 months earlier, 3 hours long, and he only needed the section beginning at minute 22. He added that this recording had never been translated. The translation he had was the version his own man had given him live in the room that day. Then he pressed the button. The diner filled with the sound of chairs scraping, papers shifting, then the voice of a man speaking German, slowly and clearly, with a northern accent. Greta sat straighter. She closed her eyes for about 2 seconds, and when she opened them, she began to speak, and her voice was completely different from the one she had used in the hotel kitchen the day before. She kept pace with every sentence, never stumbling, never adding, never leaving anything out, stopping exactly where the man on the recording stopped, preserving even the places where someone began a thought and abandoned it halfway through. Rafe didn't look at the recorder. He watched her. 3 minutes passed that way. When the recording reached a point where 2 men on the other side of the table began speaking over one another, she translated both of them and identified which man had said which sentence. At minute 29, she reached out and pressed stop. Then she told him something he hadn't asked. She said that in the section they had just heard, the man sitting in the 3rd chair had said their side needed clarification on one point, that if the operating rights to the harbor were pledged as collateral for the syndicated loan, then, in the event the borrower failed to meet its obligations, those rights would transfer to the lenders without any additional procedure being required. She said the man had repeated the sentence twice, the second time more slowly than the first, in the way people speak when they want to make certain something enters the official record. Then she said, and this was where her voice dropped, that she was almost certain that sentence wasn't in Rafe's English version. Rafe didn't answer. He pulled the document case from beneath his chair, set it on the table, opened it, and turned to the transcript of the Hamburg meeting. He searched by the timestamps printed in the margin. Minute 22, minute 25, minute 29. He read slowly, one finger following each line, finished the page, turned to the next, then flipped back again. In his version, there was only one sentence covering that entire section, stating that Hansa Nord confirmed the financing structure had been agreed upon by both parties and had no further comments. Nothing about the harbor. Nothing about collateral. Nothing about the operating rights passing into anyone else's hands. Rafe sat still for a very long time, one hand resting on the page. Then he said, his voice low, almost to himself, that in 4 years he had never caught that man getting a single word wrong. Greta looked at him, and she understood what that meant before he did. She said that in order to catch an interpreter saying something wrong, there had to be a second person in the room who understood both languages. She asked whether, in those 4 years, there had ever been a second person like that. Rafe didn't answer, and the silence itself was the answer. He closed the file. He looked at her for a moment, then asked what she did for a living. Greta said she poured coffee. He asked what she had done before. She said she used to be someone like him. Rafe didn't ask another question about it, didn't mention the disciplinary board, didn't mention the 3 words in the file he had read at midnight. He only slid the recorder toward the middle of the table, leaving it exactly halfway between them, and asked her what she would need if he asked her to listen one more time, this time in person. Rafe made his proposal simply, as though it were the only obvious thing to do. He said that tomorrow she would sit at the table, in the chair to his left, as a second interpreter for his side. He would introduce her, and from that moment on, no one in that room would dare mistranslate a single word again. Greta shook her head before he had even finished. She said that if she sat down in that chair, then within 3 seconds his interpreter would understand exactly what was happening. The man would translate every word correctly for the entire meeting, politely, precisely, without getting so much as a comma wrong. The people on the other side of the table would talk among themselves about the weather and their flight. The negotiations would be postponed for some perfectly reasonable reason. The board in Hamburg would need more time. And 3 weeks later he would sign an almost identical agreement in another city, with another interpreter he trusted just as much. She said he would have a perfectly clean meeting, and he would have nothing at all. Rafe sat silently. Then he asked why they couldn't simply record the entire meeting and give it to her to translate afterward, that evening, somewhere safe where no one would know. Greta said that by the time she finished translating it, he would already have signed. She said the summary of terms was placed in front of him for initials every evening, and they were pushing the schedule according to Hamburg time, which meant that every meeting ended with a document being signed almost immediately afterward. He didn't need to know what they had lied about. He needed to know at the exact moment they were lying, while there was still time for him not to nod. Rafe looked at her. He asked what she wanted to do instead. Greta placed both hands on the table and told him what she had spent the entire previous night thinking about while lying on the sofa, knowing that sooner or later this meeting would happen. She said she would keep wearing her uniform. She would keep carrying trays, keep pouring coffee, keep standing beside the service cabinet with her hands folded in front of her, exactly as she had for the past 2 days. No one in that room looked at the face of the woman pouring coffee, and that was the one thing she had that he couldn't buy with money. She said she would wear a small earpiece, the kind that could be hidden beneath her hair, and she would interpret simultaneously, in a whisper for one of his people sitting in the room next door with a recorder running continuously. That person would record everything she said, with the time and the exact minute marked beside it. That person wasn't to know who she was. Then she continued, and her voice grew firmer at this part, saying that no one in the building was to know her name, not her shift manager, not human resources, not any of his people. No one. If anyone asked why one hotel server had been assigned to work the entire 3-day meeting, the answer was that the hotel was short-staffed, and that had to be the only answer. Rafe listened to all of it without interrupting once. Then he asked how much she wanted. Greta said she didn't want money. He waited. She said she wanted him to record everything, from the first sentence of the meeting to the last, the German, the English, even the breaks when people thought no one was listening anymore. Record all of it. Keep all of it. Erase nothing. Even the parts where nothing happened. Rafe asked why. Greta said that 6 years ago, no one had recorded anything. She said only that sentence and nothing more, offering no explanation, then lifted the cold coffee and took a sip simply to give her hands something to do. Rafe Castellari looked at the woman sitting across from him for a long time. Then he nodded. He said all right. He said someone would bring the earpiece to her at 2 o'clock that afternoon, and from that moment forward, inside that building, she didn't know him. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in the Rosewood room, Greta walked in carrying a tray of coffee exactly as she had on the previous 2 days, her hair tied low enough to cover her left ear, where something no larger than a pea rested close against the ear canal. In the room next door, separated by a single wall, a man she had never met sat in front of 2 recording machines and a notebook. She poured for each person, moved around behind their chairs, then stepped back to her place beside the service cabinet, hands folded in front of her stomach, eyes lowered toward the floor. Then she began to speak, very softly, barely moving her lips, using the same whispering voice she had once maintained for 4 straight hours inside a glass interpreting booth 6 years earlier without a break. Conrad Lehman opened with the matter of Pier 7. He said in German that their side agreed to have Pier 7 operated by the joint venture, but that authority over docking schedules and berth allocation had to belong to the management board appointed by Hansa Nord, while the American side would retain a consultative role. Greta whispered exactly that into the earpiece, including the minute markers. Then Ansel Rice began speaking, and he told Rafe that the German side agreed Pier 7 would be operated by the joint venture under shared management authority, that both sides would make decisions together regarding docking schedules, and that they would appoint a technical coordination board. Rafe nodded. He said thank you, and said that sounded reasonable. Greta remained still, her hands folded in front of her stomach, and she could feel her heartbeat pulsing in her throat. 15 minutes later, they reached the section concerning the capital withdrawal period. Bettina Haas said that under the current structure, the American investor would only be allowed to withdraw its capital after completion of the third transfer phase, meaning no earlier than 96 months from the date of signing, and any request for early withdrawal would require written approval from the board in Hamburg. 96 months. 8 years. Greta whispered the number twice into the earpiece, to make certain the man on the other side of the wall hadn't misheard her. Ansel turned toward Rafe and said the German side confirmed that the capital lockup period was 36 months, meaning 3 years, after which both parties could renegotiate according to market conditions. Rafe took a sip of coffee. He said 3 years was acceptable. He smiled at Lehman across the table, and Lehman smiled back. And inside those two smiles, no one was speaking the same language, and no one was talking about the same contract. Then came the phrase Greta had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. Bettina Haas said that in order to secure the American side's financial obligations during the construction phase, the agreement required a Persönlicher Berg, and she repeated the term, making it clear that this had to be an individual guaranteeing the obligation with personal assets and accepting personal liability, not a legal entity. Greta whispered the exact meaning, then whispered it again more slowly, separating each word. Ansel translated the phrase into English as an authorized representative of the American side signing in confirmation. Nothing more. One phrase became another, sounding almost identical to someone who didn't know the language, yet separated by the entire personal fortune of one human being. Rafe nodded for the third time. At that exact moment, Greta stepped forward to refill the cup at the fourth seat, and her hand shifted half an inch offline, causing coffee to spill over the rim and onto the saucer. A very small sound in a very quiet room. She immediately took a cloth from the tray and wiped it away, apologizing in English in an even voice. But when she looked up, Ansel Rice was watching her. It wasn't the brief glance of someone irritated by an interruption in the middle of a sentence. He looked at her longer than that. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. His eyes fixed on her face rather than the coffee stain on the saucer, and the corner of his mouth tightened slightly in the way of a man who had just remembered something but hadn't yet found the name for it. Greta lowered her head, finished wiping the saucer, and didn't breathe. She stepped back to her place and remained there until the meeting ended, whispering every sentence, leaving nothing out. That evening, in the room on the 16th floor, Rafe listened to the recording again and compared each line against the official transcript Ansel had submitted. He had enough to stop the deal the very next day. He had enough to throw a man out of his house, but he sat for a very long time in front of the papers, thinking about a question the recording couldn't answer, which was that an interpreter, no matter how skilled, couldn't possibly know in advance that there was going to be an accident. The next morning, between 2 meeting sessions, Greta pushed through the wooden door into the service corridor carrying a tray of dirty cups, and Ansel Rice was standing there. He was leaning one shoulder against the wall beside the door, both hands tucked into his trouser pockets, with the posture of a man who had already been waiting there for some time. This corridor led nowhere except the auxiliary kitchen and the freight elevator. There was no reason for anyone from the delegation to be standing there. Greta stopped. He looked up and said her name. Vogel. He said it softly, almost familiarly, the way someone might greet a former colleague unexpectedly encountered at an airport. He said, "I thought you moved to another state." Greta stood still with the tray in her hands and said, "I stayed." Ansel nodded slowly, as though that answer deserved consideration. He said, "You know, back then I heard you called a lot of places." "A lot." Then he stopped. He looked at her uniform, at the tray, at the dried streak of soap on the cuff of her sleeve, and he said nothing more about it. He said, "Do you know why I lasted longer in this profession than you did? It wasn't because I was better than you. Back then, you were better than me. Everyone in the profession knew it." He said it was because she had never understood that inside a room, people didn't pay her to say what was true. They paid her to stay in her proper place. Greta didn't answer. Ansel pushed himself away from the wall and stood upright. He said, "You've been very good at keeping quiet for 6 years. Better than I ever expected." Then he said, still in that same pleasant, even voice, that there were only 3 days left. 3 days. Then everyone would fly home, and she would still be here, still have her job, still have her night shift, and no one would have to reopen any old files. He stepped past her, walked 2 paces, then stopped and turned his head. He asked how her mother had been lately. Greta didn't turn around. He said, "I read about it. Her kidneys, right? It's serious. 3 sessions a week must be exhausting." Then he said the name of the center. Clearly, in full. Even the street name, the same name Greta wrote in the notebook in the kitchen drawer once every month when she added up everything that still had to be paid. He didn't say another word after that. He gave her no instruction, made no statement she could repeat to someone else, said nothing that, if recorded, anyone could point to and call a threat. He had simply asked about her mother's health, and he knew where she went for dialysis. Ansel Rice pushed through the wooden door into the meeting room, and it closed behind him with a small click. Greta remained alone in the corridor. The tray in her hands began to feel heavier. She walked to the metal table at the far end of the hallway, set it down, and stood there with both hands resting on the edge. She thought about the 4th-floor apartment with no elevator, about the broken lock that had to be pushed open with a shoulder, about the woman sitting beside the window with the gray wool coat draped over the back of the chair across from her, the woman who still asked every afternoon whether anyone had called her daughter's name that day. She thought about 3 sessions a week, 4 hours each. She thought about the shuttle that arrived outside their building at 6:45 in the morning, and the driver who always sounded the horn twice in 2 short bursts. She stood there for a very long time. Inside the room came the sound of chairs being pulled out, someone saying something in German, followed by a brief laugh. Greta lifted her head, straightened her collar, and checked with her fingertips that the hair on the left side still covered her ear completely. Then she picked up the fresh coffee pot, pushed open the door, and went inside to pour for each person one by one. At 9 o'clock the next morning, before Greta had even made it up to the 14th floor, the shift manager came looking for her in the changing area and told her human resources needed to see her. He didn't look her in the face when he said it. The human resources office was on the 2nd floor, behind a frosted glass door, and inside sat a woman at a desk with a stack of printed papers turned face down in front of her. She invited Greta to sit, then turned the papers over and began to read. A complaint had been made by the guests renting the private meeting room on the 14th floor, stating that a member of the service staff had repeatedly remained in the room longer than necessary, had positioned herself where she could overhear the contents of private discussions, and had appeared to be paying attention to the conversation instead of performing her service duties. The hotel considered this a serious violation of its confidentiality rules regarding guests. Greta said she had been assigned to remain for the entire meeting because they were short-staffed, and that the shift manager had been the one who assigned her. The woman said she knew. Then she said that even so, with this kind of complaint, the hotel had no other option. Her employment was terminated effective immediately. Because the termination fell under the category of serious misconduct, there would be no notice pay, and the wages for the 19 days she had already worked that month would be withheld pending review, with no specified timeline for when that review would be completed. Greta sat in silence. She asked who had filed the complaint. The woman said she wasn't permitted to provide that information. Greta asked how the complaint had been submitted. The woman paused for a moment, then said she had received it by telephone the previous afternoon, and that was all she was allowed to say. She pushed 2 sheets of paper across the desk, pointed to the places where Greta needed to sign, and said she was sorry, in a voice so sincere that Greta knew she truly did feel guilty, and also truly wasn't going to do anything differently. Greta signed. She returned her employee badge, returned her locker key, took off her uniform, and put her own clothes back on. Inside her locker was a box of tea, an extra pair of socks, and a piece of hard bread wrapped in a napkin that the old dishwasher had given her 2 nights earlier. She left the bread behind. After walking out through the employee entrance, she stood on the sidewalk and took out her phone, and she realized there was no number she could call. She didn't have the number of the man on the 16th floor. That had been one of her own conditions. At 11 o'clock, She arrived at the dialysis center to pick up her mother, just as she did every Friday. At the reception desk, the administrative assistant asked whether she had received the letter yet. Greta said no. The young woman opened the computer system, turned the screen so Greta could see it, and explained that the program covering Ilse Vogel's co-payments had been approved under the category of stable employment, that the file had been updated that morning, and that the assistance would end the following Monday. The transportation service was part of that same assistance package. She said Greta could submit a new application under a different category, but the average review time was 6 to 10 weeks. Greta asked what they were supposed to do during those 6 to 10 weeks. The young woman looked at her and had no answer. Her mother came out of the dialysis room a little before noon, a bandage on her elbow, walking slowly and needing to steady herself against the wall. She asked whether Greta had the day off work. Greta said yes, she had the day off. Ilse nodded and said that was good, because Greta worked too many nights. Mother and daughter waited outside for the car. The driver sounded the horn twice in the same short bursts he always did. When they got home, Greta helped her mother climb all 4 flights of stairs, stopping twice on the landings to rest, then opened the door by turning the key twice and pushing with her shoulder. She cooked dinner, set the table, washed the dishes, and waited until her mother fell asleep. Then she opened the apartment door, stepped into the shared hallway, sat down on the top stair, and stayed there. She didn't cry. She sat with both hands resting on her knees, staring into the darkness between the floors, working through the same calculation over and over. Only this time, there truly was no answer, and she remained there until the motion sensor light on the 3rd floor went dark. Then the light on the 2nd floor went dark, and finally night settled completely around her. At roughly the same time, on the 16th floor of the Ardan House Hotel, no one checked one very small detail again. The call to Human Resources at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon hadn't come from the German delegation, hadn't come from the Rosewood Room, and hadn't come from Ansel Reese. It had come from August Marchetti's private number. At 9 o'clock that night, Greta was still sitting on the top step of the staircase when she heard footsteps coming up from below, slow and even. One person alone, and the motion sensor light on the 3rd floor came on. Then the one on the 4th, and Rafe Castellari stopped on the landing 5 steps below her. He had no one with him. He asked if she was all right. Greta said she was fine. He climbed the remaining 5 steps and stood there. And in the hallway light she saw his wrist, the watch with the scratched crystal, the only thing on him that didn't look expensive. He said he had only learned what happened at 7 o'clock. He said the complaint hadn't come from him, and he would find out where it had come from. Then he took a thick envelope from inside his coat and held it out to her. He said it contained what she deserved to be paid for the past 3 days, along with extra for what he knew she was about to have to pay. Greta looked at the envelope in his hand. She rose from the stair, brushed her hands against the sides of her thighs, and pushed it back toward him. "I'm not selling what I just did." Rafe didn't withdraw his hand immediately. He held the envelope there for another moment, then slipped it back into his coat pocket. And in that instant, she saw him give the smallest nod, not a nod of agreement, but the nod of someone who had just understood something about the person standing in front of him. He asked what she wanted instead. Greta stood there in front of the apartment door with its broken lock, in a hallway carrying the smell of food from 4 different homes, and asked him the question she had kept inside herself for 6 years, without ever saying it aloud to anyone. My father's name was Thomas Vogel. He was the union secretary at the harbor for 22 years. 6 years ago, he started asking questions about an altered transcript, my transcript. He asked around the harbor, asked the people who kept the records, asked who had been the last person to handle those papers. 3 weeks later, he left the house one night and never came home. A car with no license plates, a street with no cameras, and the case was closed after 4 months. She stopped, looked directly into his face, and asked whether any of his people had been involved. There was no sound in the hallway except the hum of a refrigerator in the apartment next door, starting up and then shutting off. Rafe Castellari didn't answer immediately. He didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't tell her she was mistaken, didn't say something like that could never have happened, didn't offer any reassurance that would have been so easy to say, and so easy to believe in darkness like this. "I don't know." Greta heard those 3 words and felt something inside her chest collapse. Not from pain, but from exhaustion. "That's the worst answer." "It's the true one," Rafe said. Then he asked which answer she wanted. She couldn't answer. He continued, his voice still low and measured as it always was, saying that the harbor had belonged to his family since before he was born. 6 years ago, he hadn't been the one in charge. His father was still alive, and things had happened there that even now he hadn't finished going through on paper. He said that if he told her his people weren't involved, he would be guessing. And if he told her they were, he would still be guessing. He didn't want to guess about something like that with her. Greta asked what happened now. Rafe was silent for a moment. Then he said he would promise her only one thing. And he said it very clearly, one word at a time, that he would find the answer to that question. He would reopen the records from those years. All of them. Including the parts he had never touched because they belonged to his father. And if the answer was inside his own house, he would still bring it back here and tell her. Greta looked at him for a very long time. She didn't say thank you. She only asked him one final question, what he would do if the answer really was inside his house. Rafe Castellari said he didn't know, and it was the second time that night he had told her something he could have made much easier by lying. Greta went inside close to 10 o'clock and thought her mother had already fallen asleep. But the living room light was still on, and Ilsa was sitting in the chair beside the window, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes looking outside. She turned when she heard the door, and Greta understood immediately, simply from the way her mother looked at her, that tonight she was fully present. Not the half-clarity of those afternoons when she remembered her daughter's name, but forgot what day of the week it was. Ilsa looked at her and asked why she had quit her job. Greta sat down on the edge of the sofa. She said she hadn't quit. They had let her go. Her mother asked why. Greta was quiet for a moment, then said because she had heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Ilsa nodded slowly. She didn't ask anything else. She looked toward the chair across from her, where the gray wool coat had been draped over the back for 6 years, and she said, "Your father did too." Greta looked up. Ilsa spoke calmly and clearly, without stumbling over a single word, saying that 3 weeks before he disappeared, he came home late one evening, sat in the exact place where Greta was sitting now, and told her that if anything happened to him, she mustn't give his coat to anyone. She said she had asked him what he meant by anything happening, and he told her, "It was nothing. Just remember what I said." Then he went to bed. She said she had remembered that sentence for 6 years. She couldn't remember what day of the week it had been, couldn't remember what he had been wearing, and sometimes she couldn't even remember what year it was now. But that sentence she remembered. Don't give it to anyone. Greta sat very still. She asked whether her mother had ever looked inside the coat to see if there was anything there. Ilsa said no. She said he had told her not to give it to anyone, not to open it and look inside. Greta stood up. She walked to the chair across from her and stood in front of it for a while. She had passed that chair every day for 6 years. She had dusted it, moved it aside to clean the floor, and pushed it back into place. And once she had tried to fold the coat neatly, only to have her mother get out of her sickbed and take it away from her. Greta reached out with both hands and lifted the coat. It was heavier than she expected. The wool had faded across the shoulders. The bottom button had been replaced with one of a different color, and the collar still held the crease left by a man who had always turned it up against the wind. Greta turned the lining inside out. The silk was worn thin, and along the seam on the left side, hidden beneath the pocket, there was a section sewn with thread that didn't match the original, hand-stitched with large, uneven stitches, the kind of stitching done by a man who had held a needle no more than 3 times in his life. She ran her fingers along that section and felt something small and hard inside. She took the scissors from the kitchen drawer, sat down on the floor, laid the coat across her lap, and cut the stitches one by one. Inside, between the 2 layers of fabric, was a small key made of dull metal, with the name of a storage locker company stamped into the head and the number 42. Beside it was a piece of paper folded into quarters, the yellowed graph paper used in union notebooks, and written on it in her father's handwriting, every letter capitalized the way he always wrote when taking minutes, was a string of letters and numbers in the exact format of a shipping container identification number, and beneath it, a date from 6 years earlier. Nothing else. No letter, no message, no one's name. Greta sat on the living room floor, with the key resting in her palm and the piece of paper on her knee. Above her, her mother remained in the chair beside the window, looking outside, asking nothing. 6 years ago, Greta had made 41 phone calls and then stopped. For 6 years, she had walked through this room every day, had eaten dinner less than 6 feet away from it, had told her mother that no one had called her name and that this was a good thing. And through all those 6 years, the thing her father had gone looking for and never managed to bring home had been here all along, inside her own apartment, hanging over the back of a chair that no one was allowed to touch. At 6 in the morning, the intercity bus terminal on the west side of the city was only beginning to receive its first passengers, and Greta walked through the waiting hall toward the row of storage lockers at the far end of the basement corridor, where white light fell across metal doors with paint peeling from their edges. She had called the service desk the night before and had been told that long-term lockers paid years in advance were left untouched, and if the rental had expired, the contents would be moved into storage. She had no idea how many years her father had paid for. She stood in front of locker number 42, inserted the key, and it turned. Inside was only a brown cardboard document envelope, the thick kind used to hold large files, its edges softened by time. Greta took it out, closed the locker door, and walked over to a nearby row of waiting seats. She sat down and opened the envelope. The first thing inside was a stack of papers about 30 pages thick, photocopies, slightly blurred around the edges but entirely readable. It was the transcript from the second hearing in the maritime arbitration case, not the version the disciplinary board had held in its hands. On the final page was her certification signature, her handwriting, dated exactly the day she had signed it, and through the middle pages were the sentences she still remembered translating, the same sentences that 6 years earlier no one had been willing to hear her say had been changed. She turned through the pages one by one, slowly, and when she reached page 17, she had to lower the stack onto her lap and sit still for a while, because for the first time in 6 years, she was looking at proof that she had not remembered it wrong. The second thing in the envelope was a small photograph printed on photo paper, the kind taken with a film camera and developed at a shop. It showed an open ledger lying on a tabletop, photographed at a slight angle, with the shadow of the photographer's hand visible along the upper edge and the warm yellow light of a desk lamp falling across the page. It was a page from the Harbor Operations Office cash ledger, the kind of disbursement book every union secretary knew exactly which drawer contained it and exactly which day of the month it was opened. 7 payments were listed on the page. 6 were ordinary expenses, with familiar contractors named as recipients. The fourth line from the top listed a transportation company Greta had never heard of, and in the beneficiary column, handwritten clearly, were the words A. Rice. The amount appeared in the next column. The payment date fell within the 3 weeks before the second hearing. And in the final column, the one reserved for authorization, there was no full signature, only 2 initials intertwined in the distinctive style of someone who had initialed documents thousands of times in his life. A. M. Greta sat on the bench in the bus terminal, surrounded by announcements for the Albany departure and the sound of suitcase wheels rolling over tile, and stared at those 2 letters for a very long time. Her father had not been asking questions blindly. He had known exactly what to look for, and exactly where to find it, because he had sat in that office for 22 years and knew which page the money passed through. He had found the name of the person who received it. He had found the initials of the person who approved it. He had photographed the page, brought it home, sewn it into the lining of his coat beside the key, and given his wife only one instruction. Then, 3 weeks later, he had walked out of the house one evening. He had found everything. He simply had not lived long enough to give it to anyone. Rafe Castellari received the photograph at 10 o'clock in the morning, and he said nothing for the next 2 hours. He had his people open the archive at the harbor office and bring up 6 boxes of records from the years he had never touched because they belonged to his father's time, and he sat on the floor of the 16th floor room, turning through each ledger one by one. The name of the transportation company on the cash ledger page appeared for the first time in the 3rd quarter of that year, then disappeared 11 months later. There was no contract, no invoice, not a single vessel that had ever been loaded or unloaded. There were only payments. He found the authorization signature register, the leather-bound book his father had kept in the safe and opened only once a year. For that company, during the entire period of its existence, only 2 people had ever been authorized to approve payments. The first had died 5 years earlier in a restaurant parking lot. The second was sitting in the dining room on the ground floor, eating a late breakfast as he did every day. Rafe took the stairs down. He brought the photograph and the authorization register with him, placed both on the table, then pulled out a chair and sat across from August Marchetti. Gus looked at the photograph first, then at the leather-bound book, then set down his knife and fork, wiped his hands on his napkin, and made no move to touch either one. Rafe asked whether he wanted to take a closer look. Gus said there was no need. Rafe asked whether he wanted to say those weren't his initials. Gus said he wasn't saying that. At that moment, there were only 2 waiters standing at the far end of the dining room, and Rafe gave them one look, and they left. Gus sat upright with both hands resting on the table, and he said that if Rafe wanted to ask something, then ask it. Rafe asked how long he had been paying that man. Gus said since before Rafe even knew who he was. Rafe asked why. Gus didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window, then spoke in the same voice he had always used when explaining something to Rafe when he was young, saying that Rafe's father had left him an empire, not a sign outside the harbor gate. An empire, 25 years, 3 generations, and not one of those 3 generations had ever needed anyone's permission to do business on their own docks. He said Rafe was planning to put all of that into a contract with audits, payroll records, and a board in Hamburg sitting over their heads. And for what? So people could say his name without lowering their voices. He said Rafe thought he was bringing this house into the light. What he was really doing was placing it in someone else's hands. And Gus couldn't sit there and watch it happen. I'm saving it from you. Rafe listened to everything. He didn't interrupt once. Then he asked another question, and he asked it very slowly, whether Gus knew a man named Thomas Vogel. Gus went silent. He lifted his coffee cup, took a sip, and set it back down. He didn't ask who that was. He didn't pretend to think. He said 4 words. He asked too much. Then he said nothing else. Rafe Castellari remained seated. He didn't spring to his feet. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He didn't call anyone into the room. He looked at the man sitting across from him, the man who had taught him how to shake hands, how to count money without looking down, the man who had sat in the second row at his father's funeral and held his shoulder when he walked out of the church, the man who still occasionally called him kid. He looked at him for a very long time, and during all of it, Gus never looked away. Then Rafe picked up the photograph and the leather-bound register from the table. He stood. He pushed the chair back into its proper place, neatly, the way someone does when leaving a meal. Gus said his name once. Rafe didn't turn around. He walked the full length of the room, reached the door, and closed it behind him gently, without a sound louder than the latch settling into place. Inside, August Marchetti remained exactly where he was, sitting in front of a plate of food that had gone cold, in a room where no one else remained. At 10 o'clock Monday morning, the Rosewood Room was arranged according to the precise ceremony of a formal signing. Fresh table linens, 2 leather-bound sets of contracts placed symmetrically at opposite ends, 2 pens waiting on a silver tray, and a cameraman standing in the corner awaiting the signal to begin. All 7 representatives from Hansa Nord were present, with Konrad Lehmann seated in the center, and Bettina Haas to his right. A stack of documents in front of her already marked at the pages requiring signatures. Rafe Castellari entered last, shook hands with each person, took his seat at the head of the table, and placed both hands on the contract exactly as he had during the previous meetings. Ansel Rice sat to his right, back straight, notebook open, pen uncapped and ready. The ceremony began with a brief statement from Lehmann. He spoke in German about a lasting relationship between 2 sides of the Atlantic, and Ansel translated it into English, smoothly, at the proper pace, neither fast nor slow. Rafe nodded. He smiled. He thanked him. Then the large doors of the meeting room opened. Not the small wooden door in the corner leading to the service corridor. The door that had opened and closed throughout the past 3 days whenever someone entered carrying a coffee pot. The main doors, double doors with brass handles, the doors through which guests entered. Greta Vogel walked in through those doors. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't carrying a tray. She walked directly to the table, pulled out the empty chair to Rafe's left, placed a folder and a stack of printed pages on the tabletop, and sat down. A very brief silence passed through the room as all 7 people on the other side of the table turned in the same direction, none of them understanding what was happening. Greta looked up and introduced herself in German. She gave her full name, first and last. She said she would be serving as the second interpreter for the American side during today's proceedings. She spoke in precise Northern German, clean and effortless, without the slightest trace of someone who had spent 15 years living in America, and every one of the 7 people across the table recognized it immediately. Bettina Haas stopped turning pages. To Rafe's right, Ansel Rice turned his head. He looked at Greta, and during those 3 seconds the color drained from his face, not turning red but growing pale. The pallor of a man who had just realized that for 3 straight days he had been sitting beside the answer to a question he had never thought to ask. Rafe said in English that, for the sake of completeness, every statement today would be translated twice. Ansel first, miss. Vogel second. He said it was an internal procedure on their side, and he hoped the German delegation would understand that it might lengthen the proceedings. No one could reasonably object to something like that. Lehmann continued his remarks. Ansel translated. Then Greta translated. The first time, the 2 versions matched. The second time, they matched again. On the 3rd statement, when Lehmann spoke about the scope of authority held by the Joint Ventures Management Board, Ansel translated it as shared management, and Greta repeated the original meaning exactly, then added 3 words. The first translation differs. She didn't emphasize them. She said them the way someone reads from an official record. Rafe asked where it differed. Greta read the two versions side by side, the German first, then both English versions, and placed a printed sheet on the table with the exact time marked on it. No one said anything. Lehman continued. Ansel translated, his voice already becoming shorter. Greta repeated the translation. The first translation differs. Then again, and again. Every time she spoke those 3 words, she placed another sheet of paper on the table, and the stack in front of Rafe grew 1 page at a time, while no one in the room was able to maintain the expression they had worn that morning. When they reached the provision concerning the personal guarantor, Bettina Haas reached out and touched Lehman's arm, a very small gesture, and he didn't react. No one noticed exactly when Ansel Rice stopped translating. He sat silently with both hands resting on his notebook, his pen still uncapped. Greta reached the 11th sheet, placed it on the stack in front of Rafe, and spoke those 3 words one final time. Conrad Lehman stopped speaking. He was in the middle of a sentence, and he simply stopped there, closed the folder in front of him, and said nothing more. Rafe Castellari didn't ask anyone a single question. He didn't ask Lehman why he had stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Didn't ask Bettina Haas why she had closed her folder. Didn't turn to his right and ask the man who had sat beside him for 4 years whether he had anything he wanted to say. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a small black recorder, placed it in the middle of the table at exactly the same distance from both sides, and pressed the button. The room filled with the background sounds of another room, porcelain touching saucers, chairs shifting, someone making a remark about a flight. Then came 2 voices, speaking German, very softly, close together, the kind of softness used by 2 people leaning toward each other, because they believed no one within 10 feet could understand them. Bettina Haas recognized her own voice first. She set down her pen. The recording lasted less than 20 seconds. Rafe let it play to the end, then pressed stop, and no one in the room moved. He turned to his left and said in English that Miss Vogel should please translate the passage they had just heard into English, word for word, formally, for the record. Greta pulled the blank sheet of paper in front of her closer. She said she needed to hear it once more. Rafe played the recording a second time. She listened to the entire passage, nodded, and then began to translate. Her voice was even, neither fast nor slow, the voice of someone reading an official record in a room with microphones, and she translated exactly as she had been trained to do, and as she had done for years before they took her name away from her. The first speaker said that everything would be finished as soon as he signed, because the final payment had already been made to him. She stopped exactly where the speaker on the recording stopped. Then she translated the second speaker, saying that after the signing ceremony, an accident would erase whatever remained. She finished the sentence, set down her pen, and sat upright with both hands resting on the table. She wasn't trembling. She didn't look to her right to see the expression on the other interpreter's face. She looked straight ahead, like any interpreter who had simply completed her work. There wasn't a sound in the room. The cameraman in the corner had lowered his camera at some point, without anyone noticing. Conrad Lehman sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the leather-bound contract he no longer opened. Bettina Haas looked down at the table. Ansel Rice sat to Rafe's right, and he didn't say a word, didn't object, didn't claim the translation was wrong, didn't say the recording had been edited, because apart from Greta, he was the only person in the room who understood that not one word of it was wrong. Rafe Castellari picked up the pen from the silver tray, turned it once between his fingers, then placed it back exactly where it had been. He reached forward with both hands and slowly closed the contract in front of him, and the sound of the leather covers coming together was the only sound in the room. In the same low, even voice he always used, he said that he thanked everyone. He said that for 4 years he had crossed the ocean many times, had sat in many rooms like this one, and not once had he ever known for certain who he was sitting with. He said this morning was the first time. He thanked them for showing him who they truly were. Then he stood. He didn't gather up the contract, didn't take the stack of printed pages in front of him, didn't say another word about the deal, about the 3,000 jobs, about the sign outside the harbor gate. He only fastened one button on his coat, and he stood there, and he didn't walk toward the door. The main door opened for the second time that morning. The people who entered were not Rafe's men. There were 7 of them, dressed in plain clothes, and the man in front held out a stamped document before saying anything else. He identified himself, named the agency he represented, read the identification numbers of the search warrant and the subpoena, then said that the meeting was over as of that moment, and that no one was permitted to leave the room until they had been spoken to individually. Bettina Haas sprang to her feet and said in English that she demanded to contact the consulate. No one stopped her from making the call. Conrad Lehman said nothing. He remained seated, both hands still resting on the leather-bound contract, and he looked at Rafe Castellari across the length of the table, with the expression of a man who had just realized that Rafe had known what was coming from the moment he entered the room. The man in charge turned to Rafe and asked whether he was the person who had filed the report on Saturday. Rafe said yes. The man asked whether he confirmed the contents of the materials he had turned over. Rafe said he confirmed all of it, then added one sentence that everyone in the room heard clearly, that the materials did not contain only the German side's records. They also contained the records from his own house. Every ledger he had taken from the harbor archive, including those from years he had never touched before, including the authorization signature register from his father's safe. He said he had turned them over intact, without removing a single page, and that he understood exactly what that could mean for him personally. The man in charge looked at him for a moment, then nodded and said someone would speak with him separately. At the far end of the table, Ansel Rice was instructed to stand. He rose, capped his pen, closed the notebook in front of him, and performed each movement neatly, as though he were simply concluding an ordinary meeting. Then he was escorted around the end of the table and past the chair where Greta was sitting. He stopped for exactly 1 second. He didn't turn fully toward her. He only lowered his head slightly and said in German, very softly, that 6 years ago she hadn't said anything. Greta looked up at him. She answered in German, just as softly, that 6 years ago she had believed no one was listening. Ansel Rice said nothing more. He walked out of the room, and the door closed behind him. At that same hour, more than 30 minutes away from the hotel by car, someone rang the bell at a house in Bay Ridge. August Marchetti opened the door wearing a sweater, the morning newspaper still in one hand. He didn't ask what was happening. He stood there and listened as the warrant was read in full, then said, "Let me go inside and get my coat." They allowed him to. He stepped out through the door of his own home, walked between two people down the front steps, and lowered his head as he got into the car. No one raised their voice. No one ran. In this entire story, from the room on the 14th floor to the front steps of the house in Bay Ridge, not a single gunshot was fired. Back in the Rosewood room, they began sealing the documents and taking statements. Greta remained seated in her chair, with the 11 time-marked pages she had placed on the table one by one that morning spread in front of her. An agent came to her side, asked her name, and asked whether she had served as the American side's interpreter during the meeting. Greta said yes, then spelled her last name for him to write down. The transcript inside the brown envelope was entered into the case file, and a copy of it, together with the photograph of the cash ledger page, was sent to the disciplinary board of the Interpreters Association. 7 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the mail carrier left an envelope in the mailbox on the ground floor, bearing a letterhead Greta had received only once before in her life, 6 years earlier. She carried it up 4 flights of stairs, placed it on the kitchen table, and sat looking at it for a while before opening it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a decision overturning the previous disciplinary ruling and restoring her professional certification, stating clearly that the earlier revocation had been determined to rest on documents altered by another person. The second was a copy of her new certificate, printed on watermarked paper, with her name across the middle line. The third was a half-page letter signed by the chairman of the board, containing 3 sentences of apology and 1 sentence acknowledging the professional harm she had suffered over the previous 6 years. Greta read all 3 pages, folded them again, and felt nothing. No relief, no triumph, no pain. She stood up, made tea for her mother, set the table, and that evening placed the papers in the bottom drawer beside the old envelope. 3 days later, a call came from a district court. The clerk asked whether she could accept an assignment for a hearing on Monday morning, and said they needed a certified German interpreter, and that her name had appeared on the reinstated list the week before. Greta stood in the middle of the kitchen holding the phone. The clerk repeated the question, called her Miss Vogel, and said interpreter. That was all. A stranger on the other end of the line, reading a name from a list, and calling her by the profession that belonged to her. Greta said yes, I'll take it, her voice still perfectly normal, then wrote down the time and the courtroom number. She ended the call, set the phone on the kitchen counter, and stood there crying, one hand gripping the edge of the table, crying quietly so her mother in the next room wouldn't hear, crying like someone who had held everything back for so long that she no longer knew what she had been waiting for. At the end of that month, Rafe Castellari called her. He said the harbor project was still alive, much smaller than the one he had once planned. No Hansa Nord, no board in Hamburg, but still alive, and there were 3 European partners beginning negotiations again from the start. He said he wanted her to serve as chief interpreter for every part of the project's international negotiations. Greta asked whether he was sure. He said he had never been more certain of anything in his life. She was silent for a moment, then said she had one condition. Rafe said he was listening. Greta said every negotiation session, without exception, had to be recorded in full, in 2 copies, stored separately, and either side had to have the right to request playback at any time. Even sessions with only 2 people in the room, even during breaks. Rafe asked whether she didn't trust him. Greta said she did trust him. Then she added that she didn't trust silence. On the other end of the line, Rafe Castellari didn't answer immediately. Then he said all right, and he said he would have that condition written directly into her employment contract as a separate clause, so it would never depend on who happened to be sitting in his chair someday. 1 year later, Ilse Vogel had entered a stable treatment program, with all 3 weekly sessions fully arranged, transportation arriving on time, and her periods of clarity lasting longer than before. Rafe Castellari had lost most of what his family had controlled for 25 years. He accepted responsibility for the part that belonged to him, signed agreements with federal authorities, and walked away from everything that couldn't be written honestly into the books. He kept exactly one thing, the harbor project, much smaller than the one he had once imagined on the hotel rooftop, but it had licenses, audits, a payroll, and his real name printed on every document. Greta Vogel became the chief interpreter for the international negotiations connected to that project, and every session was recorded in 2 copies and stored independently, exactly as the separate clause in her employment contract required. Outside working hours, she opened a free interpreting center on the ground floor of an old building near the harbor, accepting requests from hospitals and district courts for immigrants who had to walk into rooms where they couldn't speak the language being spoken around them. Some mornings, she sat beside an elderly woman while a doctor read out test results, and Greta translated every word, adding nothing, leaving nothing out, including the words that were hardest to hear. That autumn, when construction at the harbor began, a reporter asked Rafe Castellari what, after everything that had happened, had been the most valuable deal of his life. People expected him to name the value of the harbor project. He said the only completely honest translation he had ever received in his life had cost him nothing at all, and it had come from the woman who poured his coffee. That evening, Greta went home, and her mother was already asleep. She walked to the chair beside the window, lifted the gray wool coat, brushed the shoulders gently with the palm of her hand, then carried it into the bedroom. She opened the closet, took out a hanger, hung the coat inside, and closed the door. Greta Vogel's story leaves behind something very simple. The world doesn't become better because powerful people always make the right decisions. It becomes better because ordinary people choose to speak the truth at exactly the moment when silence would be so much easier. And no one is so small that their voice cannot save a life. If today's story made you stop for a moment and think about the kindness that still remains around us, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you care about, so that each day we can bring you another story worth hearing. We would truly love to know how you feel about Greta and the choice she made. If you had been in her place, would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Please leave an honest comment below, because every word that comes from your heart is something precious to us. We wish you and your family abundant health, peaceful days, happiness, and a heart that feels a little lighter each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.